In the summer of 1984, in a quiet cul-de-sac outside Dayton, Ohio, a postman noticed something odd. Mail was piling up on the front porch of a neat single-story home, envelopes yellowing under the sun. Inside, the air was still. Coffee sat half-drunk on the kitchen counter. A birthday card lay open on the dining table. The family's 2 cars were parked in the driveway, and the front door was unlocked. The family of 4 who lived there was gone. No signs of struggle, no note, just silence, and one envelope postmarked 2 days after they vanished. That letter would vanish from police evidence just as suddenly as the family did. And 40 years later, it's the clue that could finally crack the case. Before we start, make sure to subscribe for more deep dive investigations into cold cases, forgotten crimes, and the truths that refuse to stay buried. July 12th, 1984, Therese, 2186, Birkwood Court, Dayton, Ohio. The morning sun cut hard against the pale siding of the McRae home, turning the dew on the overgrown lawn into a shimmer of white. For the 3rd day in a row, Roy Castor slowed his postal truck in front of the low ranch-style house and frowned. The stack of mail sat exactly where he'd left it yesterday, a neat pile of bills, catalogs, and a single manila envelope without a return address. Wind had curled the corners. A faint ring of moisture marked the topmost envelope, evidence of last night's storm. Roy's job didn't normally involve thinking much about what happened after the mail landed in a box, but 3 days was too long. The McRaes were creatures of habit. Dorothy McRae always met him at the door with a quick wave, sometimes slipping him an oatmeal cookie on Fridays. Today, no one came to the door. Again. Roy stepped onto the porch. From here, he could see through the screen door into the dim living room, the shape of a couch, a coffee table stacked with magazines, a floor fan, motionless. He knocked. No answer. The second knock was louder. "Dorothy? Bill?" His voice felt too loud on the quiet street. Somewhere down the block, a lawnmower droned. Roy tried the handle on the screen door. It gave easily. The main door behind it was standing ajar by less than an inch. He leaned forward and listened. Nothing. His eyes drifted to the side table in the entryway. A pair of car keys sat there. Beside them, a set of reading glasses, neatly folded. Roy backed away, a knot forming in his gut. He knew what the Postal Service manual said. Uncollected mail may indicate occupant distress. He also knew what he'd read in the paper last spring about a family in Indiana. By the time Dayton PD arrived 20 minutes later, the porch was cordoned with yellow tape. A neighbor stood on the sidewalk, clutching a robe around herself, saying she'd heard voices 2 nights ago. Not arguing, exactly, but urgent. Inside, the house felt wrong. Too still. Coffee cups on the counter held cold, half-drunk liquid. The sink contained 3 plates, all rinsed but not washed. A birthday card, for their youngest son, Drew, lay open on the dining table, signed in 3 different hands. There was no sign of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no blood. Both family cars were in the driveway. The dog, Jasper, was in the laundry room, whimpering, his water bowl bone dry. And on the porch, the top letter in the stack drew the lead detective's attention. That plain manila envelope, no return address. Postmarked July 10, 1984. 2 days after the McRaes were last seen. July 9th, 1984. Location, Birkwood Court, Dayton, Ohio. It was the smell that made Edith Wallace stop in the middle of her driveway that Monday morning. Not the rancid stench of something dead, that would have been easier to place, but the heavy, humid stillness that seemed to carry a faint sourness. She'd been stepping out to water her geraniums when it hit her. The sun was just high enough to bleach the asphalt, and the air was thick enough to stick her blouse to her back. Across the street, the McRae house sat in perfect, motionless order. The mailbox door hung open, a stack of envelopes wedged tight inside. The flag was still up, as if someone had meant to send something but changed their mind. She remembered seeing the same envelopes the morning before, and the morning before that. Edith shaded her eyes with one hand. No car in the driveway, curtains drawn. The front steps, swept clean on Friday evening, now bore a fine scatter of dead leaves and the desiccated husks of elm seeds. Something about that house looked paused. She told herself they'd probably gone away for a weekend trip. The McRaes were that kind of family, neat, polite, predictable. Bill worked for a printing company. Dorothy made lemon pound cake for the church socials. Drew, 15, was on the track team. Emily, 12, was all knees and elbows and freckles, always pedaling her bike up and down Birkwood Court until the streetlights blinked on. But 3 days without so much as opening the mailbox? That didn't fit. Edith dragged the garden hose across the yard, the nozzle catching on the edge of the sidewalk. She kept glancing toward the McRae's place. No movement, no sound. Even the screen door, which usually rattled in the breeze, stayed still. By 10 o'clock, she'd watered the flowers twice just to give herself an excuse to linger outside. That was when she saw it, a small white shape stuck in the narrow wedge of shadow beneath their front door. A letter. It must have been pushed through the mail slot and fallen onto the rug, only part of it visible through the gap. She could just make out the curve of a postmark. She almost crossed the street then, but the voice in her head, the one that sounded suspiciously like her mother's, reminded her it wasn't her business. Still, when the mail truck came rolling up the court 15 minutes later, Edith was already halfway down her driveway. The mailman, Frank McHale, was new to the route, maybe in his late 20s, with a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He slowed when he saw her waiting. "Morning, Mrs. Wallace," he said. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "Frank, have you delivered to the McRaes since Friday?" He looked over his shoulder at the house. "Yeah, Saturday and today. And they haven't taken anything in?" "Guess not." He shrugged. "People go out of town all the time. You want me to hold it?" "No," she said quickly. I just wondered." He slid more envelopes into the already stuffed mailbox and tipped his cap before moving on. By afternoon, the sun had shifted enough that the McRae house fell under the shade of the big sycamore out front. The temperature dropped slightly, but the air felt heavier. Edith kept finding herself at the kitchen window, peering between the blinds. At 4 o'clock, a dark sedan turned into the court. It wasn't familiar. The car rolled past slowly, its driver, a man in a pale shirt, glancing at each house before pulling over across from the McRae's driveway. He stayed there for nearly 2 minutes without getting out, then drove off without so much as circling the cul-de-sac. Edith's stomach gave a slow twist. By the time the sun sank behind the trees, the mailbox still yawned open. And in the dimming light, the white edge of that letter still peeked from beneath the McRae's door, untouched. She went to bed telling herself she'd knock on their door first thing in the morning. But when she woke to the sound of a siren wailing faintly in the distance, she knew she'd waited too long. July 10th, 1984. Location, Birkwood Court, Dayton, Ohio. By morning, the street was already shimmering with heat. A thin film of humidity clung to the pavement, making the air feel almost sticky. Edith Wallace had been up since just after 6, unable to shake the uneasy weight in her chest. She told herself she'd wait until a respectable hour to go to the McRae's front door. 8 o'clock felt too early, but by 8:30 she was pacing her kitchen, coffee cooling on the counter, glancing at the clock every 30 seconds. Finally, at 10 minutes to 9, she gave up the pretense. She crossed the street, her sandals slapping the warm asphalt. From this close, the McRae house looked worse than she'd realized. The mailbox flag was still raised, paint chipped at the edges, stuffed so full that one of the envelopes had begun to curl from the heat. The front steps bore a dusting of grit and pollen, untouched since Friday. That letter beneath the door, the one she'd noticed yesterday, was still there, its corner now bent. She knocked. The sound echoed dully inside, as though the house had swallowed it. She waited, listening for footsteps, for the faint scrape of the lock turning. Nothing. She knocked again, louder this time. "Dorothy?" Silence. After the third knock, she pressed her ear against the door, straining for any sound. The hum of a fan, the creak of floorboards. The air inside felt still, thick, as if the house were holding its breath. Her hand hovered near the knob. She almost tried it, but something about crossing that line without permission felt wrong. She backed away, glancing toward the driveway, toward the closed garage door. Edith decided to try the back. The gate latch stuck a little, the way wood swells in the summer heat. The yard was just as still as the front. No towels hung on the clothesline, no bicycles leaning against the porch. The garden, which Dorothy tended meticulously, looked thirsty. The petunias drooped in the raised bed, their soil cracked. Edith knocked on the back door. The screen rattled faintly, but no one came. A thin ribbon of unease wound tighter in her chest. She could hear her own breathing, could feel her pulse in her wrists. She crossed back to her own house, the sound of cicadas buzzing in her ears. By mid-morning, she decided she couldn't be the only one noticing. She called Joan Becker 2 doors down. Joan answered on the first ring, her voice low, as if she too had been thinking about the McRaes. "They're not home," Edith said. "I know," Joan replied. "I haven't seen them since Thursday? Maybe Friday morning. I thought they'd gone to visit Bill's parents." "They didn't say anything to me," Edith said. "And the mail." She trailed off, knowing Joan would understand. By noon, the quiet had begun to feel oppressive. Birkwood Court wasn't a busy street, but it usually carried a gentle hum. Lawn mowers, children's voices, the thunk of basketballs in driveways. Today, it felt like the volume had been turned down on the whole block. At 1 o'clock, Edith called the police. Officer Tom Kearns arrived just before 2. The day's heat had climbed past 90, and sweat darkened the band of his uniform cap. He was young, maybe 30, with a kind of calm, practiced expression that made it hard to tell what he was thinking. He stepped out of the cruiser, clipboard in hand, and scanned the house before crossing to Edith. "You're the one who called?" he asked. "Yes," she said, explaining what she'd noticed. The untouched mail, the stillness, the unanswered knocks. Kearns listened, nodding occasionally, then walked up the McRae's front steps. He knocked, firm, 3 times, and called out, "Dayton Police." Silence. He tried the knob. Locked. He circled the house, checking windows, peering through the glass where curtains didn't quite meet. Edith watched him pause at the back door, lean in slightly, then move on. When he returned, his expression hadn't changed. No sign of forced entry, no sign anyone's been here since whenever they left. "Left?" Edith asked. "You think they went on a trip?" "Could be. Mail piling up happens fast." He glanced back at the house. "Do you know if they have relatives out of town?" "They do," she said. "But Dorothy usually tells someone. She'd never just disappear without saying anything." Kearns scribbled something on his clipboard. "I'll file it, see if we can get in touch with family. If you hear anything, call us." It wasn't the reassurance Edith had hoped for. That night, Edith left her bedroom window cracked, listening for any sound from across the street. She thought she heard something once, a faint creak, like a door easing shut. But when she looked out, the McRae house sat in perfect darkness, every window blind drawn. The letter beneath the door was still there in the morning. July 11th, 1984. Location: Birkwood Court, Dayton, Ohio. By dawn, a thin fog had drifted in from the river, clinging low along the quiet streets of the neighborhood. Edith was up again before sunrise, the blue light filtering through her kitchen blinds. She sat at the table, staring out toward the McRae's front porch, her untouched toast cooling on a plate. The letter was still there. Now its edges had curled further, and the ink on the address was beginning to blur from the damp air. Around 7, she saw movement 2 houses down. Joan Becker stepping out in her robe, newspaper tucked under her arm. Edith met her halfway up the sidewalk. "Anything?" Joan asked before Edith could even speak. "No," Edith said. "Not a sound." They both stood for a moment, staring at the McRae house. The stillness felt heavy, the way a room feels just after someone leaves, except no one had walked out that front door in days. Joan shifted uneasily. "Maybe we should check again. Together." Edith hesitated, then nodded. Crossing the lawn felt different in the morning mist, softer somehow, though the air carried a faint metallic tang. Edith knocked again, and again there was nothing. Joan stepped up beside her, pressing her face briefly to the front window before shaking her head. "Curtains are closed tight," Joan murmured. They moved to the side of the house. The grass along the foundation was wet, and Edith could feel the chill through her sandals. They tried the dining room window, locked, then edged toward the back. It was Joan who froze first. "Wait," she whispered. Edith followed her gaze. The upstairs hallway window, just above the back porch roof, had one blind slat tilted slightly open. Behind it, something shifted. For a heartbeat, Edith thought she'd imagined it. Then she saw it, the faintest movement, like someone stepping back into shadow. "Did you see?" she began, but Joan cut her off. "I did." They stood there, neither willing to call out. Finally, Joan found her voice. "We should call Officer Kearns again." By the time Kearns arrived, the fog had burned off, leaving the air thick with heat. He walked the perimeter again, stopping at the same upstairs window. "You're sure you saw someone?" he asked, his tone more careful than skeptical. "Yes," Joan said. "I swear there was movement. Someone's in there." Kearns shaded his eyes, peering up. The blind slat was now perfectly aligned with the others. He took a long breath. If someone's inside and not answering, that's concerning. But without probable cause, he trailed off, clearly weighing his words. Edith stepped forward. What if they can't answer? That seemed to give him pause. He radioed in, his voice clipped. "Possible welfare check, Birkwood Court address." It took another 20 minutes for a second cruiser to pull up. The officers spoke briefly. Then one retrieved a slim metal tool from the trunk. Edith's stomach knotted as she watched him work the front lock. When the door finally swung inward, a wave of warm, stale air rolled out, the kind of heat that builds behind closed windows. Kearns stepped inside first, calling out, "Dayton Police." His voice echoed strangely in the stillness. Edith couldn't see much from the porch, only the dark line of the hallway and a faint glint from a picture frame on the wall. After a moment, Kearns reappeared. "We'll need you to stay outside, ma'am." The 2 officers moved deeper into the house. Edith strained to hear. The muffled sound of footsteps, a door opening, then another, and then silence. Minutes later, Kearns emerged again, his expression unreadable. "House is empty, no sign of the McRaes." Edith stared at him. "Empty? That's impossible. We saw—" "I checked every room," he said. "No one's here, but—" He hesitated, glancing back inside. "You might want to know there's a pot on the stove, burned down to nothing, like someone was cooking and just stopped." Joan's hand went to her mouth. Kearns continued, "And there's a television on upstairs. Static. Might have been running for days." Something cold threaded through Edith's spine. "And the mail?" "Still stacked inside the door," he said. Looks like no one's touched it since last week." By late afternoon, the block was humming with speculation. Neighbors lingered on porches, voices low, eyes flicking toward the McRae's darkened windows. Some thought they'd left in a hurry, maybe for a family emergency. Others whispered about break-ins, though nothing seemed stolen. Edith couldn't stop thinking about that window. The movement had been real. She was sure of it. When night fell, she sat again by her bedroom window, the McRae's house framed in the glow of the street lamp. The blinds in the upstairs hallway were still perfectly aligned, except now one slat hung slightly askew. It felt like the house was watching her back. July 14th, 1984. Location: Burkwood Court, Dayton, Ohio. The police had come and gone twice more since that first entry, each time leaving the McRae house locked and silent. To the neighbors, it was becoming less of an incident and more of an ache, the kind you feel when something is wrong, but no one can name it out loud. By Saturday morning, Edith was walking her dog past the house when she noticed the blinds upstairs had shifted again. Not much, just enough that a sliver of morning light spilled through. She told herself it could be nothing, heat swelling the frame, a draft from an open vent, but her pace slowed all the same. Halfway down the block, she saw a city truck pull up in front of the McRae's driveway. Two men in uniforms climbed out, one carrying a clipboard. They stood there a moment, glancing toward the porch, then back at the house numbers as if to make sure they were in the right place. Edith crossed the street. "Something going on?" she asked. The man with the clipboard nodded politely. "Gas company. Got a call to check the meter. Routine, but nobody answered when we knocked, so we'll probably leave a notice." He walked to the side of the house, disappearing behind the hedges. Edith lingered by the porch steps. The letter was gone, replaced by a bright orange card, the kind utility companies leave behind. It flapped faintly in the humid breeze. A moment later, the man reappeared. "Huh," he muttered. "What is it?" "Meter's been shut off from inside. That's not standard. Usually we'd have to come out to do that. Makes you wonder why." He scribbled something on his clipboard, tore off a carbon copy, and slid it into the screen door. Then they were gone, their truck rumbling away. Edith stared at the closed door for a long time, thinking of the burned pot on the stove and the static-filled television. That afternoon, Officer Kearns returned, this time with Detective Ray Mercer from the Dayton PD's Missing Persons Unit. Mercer was in his late 40s, tall, with a measured way of moving that gave him a certain gravity. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Mrs. Lawrence," he said, "I understand you were the first to notice something unusual here?" "Yes," Edith said, recounting the week's events, the untouched letter, the movement in the upstairs window, and the gas meter discovery that morning. Mercer listened without interrupting, only nodding slightly now and then. When she finished, he glanced up at the house. "We'll take another look inside." This time, Mercer had a key from the station. The moment the door opened, the heat and stillness hit them again. Edith waited outside, but through the thin summer air, she could hear the muffled thump of shoes on carpeted stairs, the click of doors opening, the creak of floorboards. After 10 minutes, Mercer appeared in the doorway. "Could you step in for a moment, Mrs. Lawrence?" She hesitated. "Is that allowed?" "For identification purposes," he said simply. Inside, the air felt heavier than she expected. The curtains were drawn tight, muting the light, and the faint smell of burned food lingered. Mercer led her through the hallway to the living room. On the coffee table sat a stack of newspapers, all from the past week, edges curled and yellowing. He gestured toward a small side table by the wall. Recognize that? It was a ceramic ashtray, painted in pale greens and blues. Edith remembered it. She'd given it to June McRae last Christmas. Only now, instead of resting in its usual place by the couch, it sat dead center on the table, as though deliberately positioned. But what drew her attention wasn't the ashtray itself. It was what lay inside it. A single key, brass and unmarked, beside a narrow strip of paper. On the paper, in blocky handwriting, were the words, "Not yet." Edith's stomach dropped. That wasn't here before. "You're sure?" Mercer asked. "Positive. I've been in this living room dozens of times." He nodded slowly, slipping on a glove before picking up the key. This wasn't covered in dust like the rest of the table. Someone's been in here recently. Upstairs, the television still hissed with static, though the screen had dimmed from being left on so long. Mercer turned it off, and the silence that followed felt like a weight pressing on the room. In the hallway, one of the bedroom doors was ajar. Inside, the bed was neatly made, though the pillow on the left side bore a faint indentation, as if someone had lain there recently. Edith stood in the doorway, chilled. "Detective, if they've been gone all week, who—" Mercer raised a hand, quieting her. He stepped over to the dresser, where a thin layer of dust coated most of the surface, except for one small oval patch near the back. "Something was sitting here," he said, "and it's gone now." By evening, word had spread again. This time the whispers were sharper. Someone had been inside the McRae house after the police's first search. Maybe even after the second. Edith sat by her front window as the sun slipped low, the blinds casting thin shadows across her lap. She couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. At one point, as dusk deepened, she thought she saw a faint glow behind the upstairs blinds, not the steady light of a lamp, but the quick flicker of movement across a window pane. She blinked, and it was gone. July 15th, 1984. Location, Dayton, Ohio. By Sunday morning, Detective Mercer had already been at the station for 3 hours, sifting through files, rechecking dispatch logs, and trying to map the McRae's final known movements. Missing persons cases had a rhythm, he knew. A fragile timeline that hardened like plaster within days. Once set, it became difficult to break, even if it was wrong. At 8:12 a.m., the first lead of the day walked in unannounced. A young clerk from Benson's Market, just off Main, had heard the news from her aunt and thought something about last Saturday didn't sit right. She was nervous, speaking quickly, her hands still marked faintly with the red dust of produce crates. She remembered seeing June McRae around 10 in the morning, standing in the checkout line with a paper bag of groceries, milk, bread, a sack of apples. That wasn't unusual. But what struck her was the other item, a length of nylon rope, coiled neatly, the kind sold in the hardware section near the back. June had never bought anything like that before, at least not that the clerk could recall. Mercer jotted it down. "Anyone with her?" The girl shook her head. "Number." And she seemed, I don't know, like she was distracted, kept looking toward the door. When asked if she remembered what June paid with, the clerk hesitated. "Cash, which is odd. She usually wrote checks. I know because I've rung her up before." Mercer thanked her, asked her to write a brief statement, and made a note to request the store's register tape from that day. By midday, Mercer was back on Burkwood Court. Edith Lawrence was watering her front garden, her posture stiff as she watched him approach. "I have a question," he said. "Did you or anyone you know see the McRae's station wagon after last Saturday?" Edith pursed her lips. "Not after that morning. It was in the driveway around 8. By the afternoon, I can't say." Mercer glanced toward the driveway. The car was still gone. If it had been driven away last Saturday, someone had managed to keep it off every main road for over a week. That afternoon, Mercer visited Benson's Market. The manager, a stout man with thinning hair, led him to the back office and produced a roll of narrow registered tape. The date read July 7th. At 10:03 a.m., there it was. Milk, bread, apples, rope. $7.42, cash. "What about the hardware section?" Mercer asked. The manager frowned. "No cameras back there, Detective. We've been meaning to install them." Mercer pocketed a photocopy of the receipt. A coil of rope, purchased hours before the family vanished. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Around 3 p.m., he stopped by the gas company office. The technician who'd visited the McRae house the previous morning had filed his report. Interior valve shut off. No sign of tampering. No request logged. "That means someone in the house turned it off themselves," the supervisor explained, "or someone with access to the inside," which narrowed the possibilities uncomfortably. Evening was settling in by the time Mercer returned to the McRae's street. The air was heavy with the smell of cut grass and charcoal from a neighbor's grill. He stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, looking up at the darkened windows. Something about the scene bothered him. The house, too still, too perfect in its arrested state. Then it struck him. Last time he'd been here, the blinds in the front bedroom were drawn almost to the sill. Now they hung an inch higher. Mercer walked up to the porch, tested the doorknob, still locked, and peered inside. Nothing moved, but the shift in the blinds meant one of two things. The heat had warped the cord, or someone had been inside again. He made a decision. Tonight, they'd post a plainclothes officer across the street. Just before midnight, a light rain began to fall, turning the street lamp halos into soft smears of gold. The stakeout car sat in darkness at the far corner, engine off. Inside, Officer Delaney watched the McRae house through binoculars, sipping burnt coffee from a paper cup. At 1:14 a.m., movement flickered behind the upstairs curtain. A shadow crossed once, then again, slower this time, deliberate, as if testing the edge of sight. Delaney reached for his radio, but before he keyed the mic, the curtain shifted wider. The gap was narrow, but enough to see that the room beyond was lit by something faint and greenish, like the glow of a clock or a small television screen. Then, the shadow was gone. By the time Mercer arrived 20 minutes later, the house was still again, its windows black. No sign of forced entry, no response to knocking. But when they circled to the back, they found the latch on the kitchen window was undone. July 16th, 1984. Location: Dayton, Ohio. The rain had stopped just before dawn, leaving the street washed clean, the asphalt still slick and dark. The stakeout car idled at the corner, its headlights off, while Mercer stood at the edge of the McRae's backyard, looking at the unlatched kitchen window. "Window was closed earlier?" Mercer asked quietly. Delaney nodded. "Checked it myself yesterday evening. It was locked." Mercer put on gloves, sliding the pane upward with a faint creak. The smell inside was faint but distinct, stale air with a thread of something sour, like fruit beginning to rot. He swung one leg over the sill and lowered himself into the kitchen. The darkness inside was thicker than he expected, even with the early morning light starting to bleed into the sky. He didn't flip the switch. Not yet. The first rule of entering an unsecure property was to change as little as possible. The kitchen felt exactly as it had a week ago. 2 mugs in the drying rack, a jar of sugar with a spoon still inside, the fruit bowl in the center of the table. But the bananas in it were black now, their skins collapsing inward. A thin curl of gnats circled the air above them. Delaney came in behind him, closing the window carefully. "Front door's still locked. Whoever used this came in through here." Mercer's eyes drifted to the trash bin beside the refrigerator. The lid sat slightly askew. He lifted it with 2 fingers. Inside were coffee grounds, apple peels, and, half hidden beneath a torn cereal box, a wad of paper towels stained deep brown. At first glance, it looked like old coffee, but when he leaned closer, the smell told him otherwise. Blood had soaked through in places, oxidized into rust red. He stepped back. "Bag this." Delaney pulled an evidence sack from his coat pocket. "Fresh?" "Too dark to be fresh, but it's not a week old either." Mercer's mind was already running through possibilities. If the towels were newer than the last confirmed sighting, someone had been in this house days after the McRaes supposedly vanished. They moved slowly through the rooms, their flashlights tracing arcs across wallpaper, furniture, family photographs. In the living room, Mercer noticed a thin line of dust on the coffee table. Except for one spot near the center, a perfect oval where something had been recently moved. "Anything missing?" Delaney asked. "Not sure. Could have been a vase, maybe a photo frame." Mercer knelt, running a gloved fingertip along the dust ridge. Whatever had sat there was gone, taken deliberately. The hallway to the stairs was narrower than it looked from outside. At the foot of the steps, Mercer paused. "You said you saw a light upstairs last night." Delaney nodded. "Green glow, like a TV or clock." They ascended slowly. The boards gave the occasional faint pop, the kind a house made when it hadn't been walked in for days. The first door on the left was a bedroom. It looked like it belonged to the youngest boy, based on the baseball posters and the pile of toy cars near the wall. The air was stuffier here, as if the window hadn't been opened in months. Mercer's flashlight passed over the desk. A stack of schoolwork sheets sat beneath a cracked snow globe. The top sheet was a drawing, a stick figure family, with the father drawn much larger than the others. It was the date in the corner that caught his attention, July 8th, the day after June McRae was seen at Benson's Market. Mercer stared at it for a long moment. This wasn't here last week. 2 doors down was the master bedroom. The bed was made, but the coverlet had a faint depression, like someone had sat there recently. On the dresser, the alarm clock blinked 12:00. Power outage or unplugged, impossible to say. Mercer crouched to check the outlets along the baseboard. One of them was empty, a plug lying on the floor as if yanked loose. He lifted it. The cord was attached to a small portable television. "Green glow," Mercer murmured. Delaney's voice was quiet. "So they were in here last night." The last door at the end of the hallway was closed. Mercer tried the knob. Locked. He knocked once, quietly, listening. No answer. He glanced at Delaney, then braced his shoulder and gave it a sharp shove. The latch splintered. The room beyond was dark, except for the faint slice of daylight through a high window. It was empty except for a folding chair in the center and a small cardboard box against the far wall. Mercer approached the box and lifted the flaps. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, unsorted. He pulled one out. It showed the McRae family in front of their house, smiling stiffly at the camera. But when he flipped it over, the back was marked in black ink. July 12th, 1984. 4 days after they'd supposedly vanished. They collected the box, sealed the window latch, and left through the front door this time, locking it behind them. In the growing light, Mercer stood at the edge of the porch, scanning the quiet street. He'd been in homicide long enough to know when the ground beneath a case was shifting. This wasn't a disappearance frozen in time. It was still in motion, and whoever had been inside the McRae house wasn't just revisiting the past. They were altering it. July 16th, 1984. Location, Dayton, Ohio. By mid-morning, Mercer was back in the station's small evidence review room, the cardboard box from the McRae house sitting on the table between him and Delaney. The blinds were half closed against the glare, slicing the sunlight into narrow bands across the photographs spread out before them. They started in silence. The photos were all glossy 4x6 prints, some still smelling faintly of developer. Most had the same washed-out color tones. Skin too pink, grass too yellow. The signature of a cheap corner store lab. The first dozen were harmless enough. The McRaes in their yard, the boys riding bikes, June hanging laundry on the line. But it was the dates scrawled on the backs that made Mercer's stomach tighten. July 9th, July 10th, July 11th. Each one was after the day they were supposedly last seen. Halfway through the stack, Mercer found the first one that didn't sit right. It showed the family at their kitchen table, eating breakfast. The father, Henry, was halfway through a laugh, his fork suspended mid-air. One of the boys was leaning toward the camera, mouth open in a word or shout. But the angle was wrong. The picture was taken from a height above the fridge, as though someone had climbed onto the counter to snap it. Delaney frowned. No way that's a self-timer. Not unless they were doing acrobatics to set it. Mercer turned it over. July 12th. He slid it aside and kept going. Another image showed June sitting in the living room, reading a magazine. The curtain behind her was pulled back just enough to show it was night outside, the porch light casting a pale circle. The photo had a sharpness the others didn't, like it had been taken with a better camera. Mercer studied June's expression. She was smiling faintly, but her eyes weren't on the page. They were angled slightly to the left, toward whoever held the camera. As the pile dwindled, Mercer began to notice a pattern. In at least 8 of the photos, the framing suggested the photographer was standing partially hidden, behind a doorway, peering around furniture, or above the subject's eye line. They weren't candid family snapshots. They were observations. When he'd reached the last envelope in the box, he hesitated. The photos inside were darker, grainier, shot in low light. The first showed the McRae boys asleep in their beds. The next showed June, standing at the kitchen sink at night, staring out the window into the black yard. But the final photo stopped him cold. It was taken in the same bedroom as the boy's earlier picture, but one of the beds was empty. The older boy, Eric, was gone. The younger, Matthew, was curled under the blanket. The photo was dated July 14th, 2 days ago. Delaney let out a low breath. If that's right, they were in that house while we were watching it. Mercer leaned back, rubbing his eyes. The evidence shifted the timeline into something far more dangerous. This wasn't a family that had vanished in one night. This was a family being kept somewhere, maybe even in their own home, while someone decided what to do with them. He kept thinking of the blood-stained paper towels in the kitchen trash. Someone had been hurt, but not enough to stop the rest of the routine: meals, reading, sleeping. The phone on the wall rang. Delaney answered, then covered the receiver with his palm. "For you." Lab Mercer took the call. The tech's voice was flat, but with a current of urgency. "We ran quick prints on the photo backs and the box, got partials from multiple people. Some match the McRaes, no surprise. But we've got one unknown, male, adult. No match in state records." Mercer glanced at the photographs still on the table. "You sure it's not one of the neighbors we cleared?" "Positive. And here's the kicker. Same print shows up on the paper towels with the blood." By early afternoon, Mercer and Delaney were parked 2 streets over from the McRae house again, this time with a longer lens trained on the backyard. They'd decided against another entry. If the unknown man had been inside within the last 48 hours, there was a good chance he'd come back. They watched through the heat shimmer, the street quiet except for the occasional passing car. At 3:17 p.m., movement caught Mercer's eye. A figure appeared at the side gate, male, tall, wearing a brown work jacket despite the summer heat. He carried something wrapped in newspaper. The man moved quickly, glancing over his shoulder once before disappearing into the backyard. Mercer's hand tightened on the binoculars. "We've got him." They stayed put. The man didn't emerge for nearly 15 minutes. When he did, the bundle was gone. He locked the gate behind him and walked away, head down, turning the corner toward Adams Street. Delaney started the engine. "We follow." "Not yet." Mercer's gut said the backyard held something more urgent than chasing a shadow. "Circle around. Let's see what he left." The air was thick with humidity as they moved along the fence line. Mercer's shirt clung to his back by the time they reached the gate. The padlock was new, shiny against the weathered wood, but it wasn't fully latched. Inside, the yard was unchanged at first glance. Lawn overgrown, flower beds choked with weeds. But near the back steps, the dirt looked freshly turned. They knelt, gloves on, and began clearing it with their hands. 2 inches down, Mercer's fingers struck metal. It was a biscuit tin, the kind used for sewing supplies. He lifted it free, dirt sifting through the seams. Inside were more photographs. These were different, darker still. Some were taken from such close range that the subjects' faces filled the frame. In one, Henry McRae's mouth was taped shut, his eyes wide. In another, June was sitting on the floor of a small, unfamiliar room, her hands bound in front of her. The last photo showed all 4 McRaes together, Henry, June, and the 2 boys, sitting against a wall painted deep green. Each of them stared directly into the lens. None of them smiled. The date on the back was July 15th. Yesterday. They sealed the tin, their movements faster now. Whatever this was, it was no longer a cold case in slow motion. It was active, unfolding in real time, and someone was documenting it like a project. Mercer glanced toward the street where the stranger had vanished minutes earlier. "We're not watching for someone to come back anymore," he said. "We're hunting him before tomorrow." The air felt heavier as they left, the late-day sun sharp on the back of their necks. The quiet block seemed to hold its breath, every drawn curtain and still front porch masking the fact that somewhere, maybe within walking distance, the McRaes were still alive. But the man in the brown jacket was deciding for how long. July 16th, 1984, location, Dayton, Ohio. The rain had stopped by the time Mercer eased the back gate shut. Water dripped from the eaves in rhythmic taps, pooling in the warped boards of the deck. The unlocked kitchen window yawned open just enough for a thin hand to slip through. Deliberate, not the work of weather. He glanced at Delaney. "Gloves," he said. The younger officer tugged them on and carefully lifted the sash. The smell hit first, not rot exactly, but a faint, stale sourness. The kind of scent a closed-up house collects when its air has nowhere to move. Mercer stepped inside, boots landing on the linoleum without a sound. The kitchen looked exactly as it had during the first walkthrough. Cereal box on the counter, 2 plates in the sink, a folded dish towel hanging over the oven handle. But the trash can had been moved. Last week, it had been tucked against the end of the cabinets. Now it sat an inch forward, angled slightly toward the back door. The lid wasn't fully closed. Delaney flipped it open. Inside were the same paper wrappers and vegetable peels he remembered, but on top, fresh coffee grounds. Damp, still clumping. "Those aren't a week old," Delaney said quietly. Mercer agreed. "Someone's been in here since Saturday." He crouched, scanning the floor for footprints. The linoleum was clean, too clean. The faint marks from his last visit were gone. Someone had wiped the area near the back door. They moved through the downstairs rooms methodically. Living room, dining room, study. All undisturbed, save for a faint shift in the dust on the mantel. Mercer took note. When they reached the staircase, the air felt heavier. Upstairs, he pushed open the first door, the parents' bedroom. The bedspread was pulled tight, a book left open on the nightstand, spine up. The lamp cord was unplugged. In the children's room, the blinds hung in that slightly higher position Delaney had seen the night before. Mercer crossed to the window. The cord wasn't tangled. It had been pulled deliberately. He turned. "Flashlight." Delaney handed it over. Mercer crouched by the small desk under the window. On the seat of the desk chair was a faint, half-circle impression in the dust, like someone had rested a jar or a small bowl there recently. The last room was the spare bedroom. Here, Mercer noticed something strange. The faint hum of electricity, but no lights on. He traced it to the closet. Inside, wedged behind a stack of boxes, was a small portable television, plugged into an extension cord. The screen was off, but the set was warm to the touch. He didn't like the implication. "Why would someone haul a TV into a closet?" Delaney asked. Privacy, Mercer said. Or control. By 3:20 a.m., they had bagged the coffee filter, taken a dozen photographs, and dusted the back window latch for prints. The partials were smudged, no clear ridges. They left quietly, relocking the window from the outside to avoid tipping off whoever had been here. Later that morning, Mercer sat in the station's break room, the coffee in his hand gone lukewarm. He kept replaying the details. Rope from the market, gas valve shut off, unlocked window, fresh coffee grounds. The timeline no longer fit neatly into the theory that the McRaes had been taken on July 7th. If someone had been in the house last night, that meant one of two things. Either the family was still alive somewhere, or someone connected to their disappearance was keeping watch, coming back, for reasons Mercer could only guess at. He decided it was time to talk to June's sister again. At 11:05 a.m., he was standing on the front porch of Carol Whitman's modest ranch house. She looked tired, her eyes rimmed red. "I told you everything I know," she said, but her tone wavered. "Humor me," Mercer said. "When was the last time you spoke to your sister?" Carol thought for a moment. "Friday afternoon. She called about the picnic next weekend. She sounded fine. We talked about the weather. Nothing unusual? No mention of plans to leave town?" "No," Carol said. Then, after a pause, she did say something odd, though. She asked if I still had the spare bedroom ready. I thought she meant for the kids, but she never explained. Mercer made a note. Did she ever buy rope? For camping? Gardening? Carol frowned. Not that I know of. Why? By mid-afternoon, Mercer was back at the station, laying out the timeline on a corkboard. Friday, call to Carol. Saturday morning, rope purchased, gas valve turned off. Sometime after that, family vanishes. Sunday night, unknown person enters house, makes coffee, adjusts blinds, uses TV in closet. He stepped back. The pattern was there, faint but forming. Someone returning to the scene, keeping the space in a strange suspended animation. What gnawed at him most was the unlocked window. It wasn't just a point of entry. It was an invitation. That night he made the call to set a second stakeout. 2 cars this time, one on each end of Burkwood Court. If someone came back, Mercer planned to be the one waiting in the dark. July 17th, 1984. Location, Dayton, Ohio. The neighborhood was asleep by midnight. Porch lights winked off one by one, and the steady hum of cicadas swelled in the warm night air. Mercer sat low in the driver's seat, a styrofoam cup of black coffee balanced in his palm, eyes fixed on the corner of Burkwood Court. The McRae house sat dark, its windows like unblinking eyes. Across the cul-de-sac, Officer Delaney was parked in an unmarked sedan, reading by the weak glow of the dashboard light. They had worked out a signal. 1 headlight flash if either of them saw movement, 2 if the person approached the house. The first hour passed without incident. A single car drifted by, tires whispering on the asphalt. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent. By 1:15 a.m., Mercer's coffee was gone. He was just starting to wonder if the intruder had spooked when he caught the faintest shadow moving along the hedgerow behind the McRae property. Not a cat. Taller, human. He gave one quick flash. Delaney straightened in his seat. The figure paused at the back gate, crouching low. Mercer slid from his car, careful to keep to the darkness, and began closing the distance along the opposite side of the street. The man, or woman, worked quickly, fingers sliding along the latch until the gate creaked open. They disappeared behind the house. Mercer picked up speed, his shoes whispering against the grass. Inside the backyard, the intruder went straight for the kitchen window, the same one Mercer had found unlocked the night before. They lifted the sash, hesitated, then slipped inside without turning on a light. Delaney appeared at Mercer's side, breathing quietly through his nose. Mercer pointed toward the front door, mouthing, "Block it." Delaney nodded and moved off. Mercer stepped up to the window. He could hear faint movement inside, the squeak of a chair leg against the floor, the soft thud of something set down. He climbed in. The kitchen was dim, shadows cast long from the street lamp outside. The intruders stood with their back to him, bent over the counter. They were pouring something, liquid, into a mug. "Police," Mercer said. "Don't move." The figure froze. Slowly, they set the mug down, but didn't turn. "Hands where I can see them," Mercer ordered. The intruders straightened. Their hands rose, thin wrists pale against the dark of their sleeves. "Turn around." The person turned. Mercer felt his chest tighten. It was a man in his late 50s, unshaven, eyes bloodshot and sunken deep into his face. He wore a navy work jacket with a frayed collar. His expression was not one of surprise. It was closer to resignation. "Name," Mercer said. The man's mouth twitched. "Doesn't matter." "It matters to me." A long pause. "Peter Holm." By the time Delaney joined them, Holm was sitting at the kitchen table, hands cuffed in front of him. The coffee he'd been making steamed between them. "What are you doing here, Mr. Holm?" Mercer asked. Holm's gaze drifted toward the blinds in the living room, then back to Mercer. "Keeping the place as it was. As it was when they left." Mercer studied him. "How do you know the McRaes?" Holm shifted in his seat. "I don't. Not really. I used to watch the house when they were out. Make sure nobody messed with it." "You're telling me they asked you to come in here?" "No." Holm's voice was flat. "They didn't ask." Delaney frowned. "So you just let yourself in?" Holm didn't answer. At the station, they ran Holm's name. He had a record: trespassing, petty theft, and one arrest in '78 for stalking a neighbor. Never did time for that one. Charges were dropped. Mercer sat across from him in the interview too, tape recorder running. "You've been in this house before," Mercer said. "How many times?" Holm scratched the side of his neck. 3, 4. "When was the first time?" "A few days after they were gone." "How did you know they were gone?" Holm looked him in the eye for the first time. "Because I saw them leave." The words hung in the air. "Tell me about that," Mercer said. Holm leaned back, cuffs clinking softly. "Saturday night, around 10. Van pulled out of the driveway. They all got in together." "Where were you?" "In the alley behind the garage. I was watching." Mercer kept his voice level. "Why were you watching?" Holm shrugged. "Habit. I watch a lot of houses." "What happened next?" "They didn't come back. Couple days later, I saw a man I didn't recognize go inside. He stayed a while, then left. I figured if nobody was home, I'd keep things the way they were." By 4 a.m., they had no more answers than before. Just a man who liked to watch and enter other people's homes. He was holding something back. Mercer could feel it. When they finally released Holm on a trespassing charge, Mercer told Delaney to tail him, not to lose sight of him for a second. The sun was just coming up when Mercer drove past the McRae house again. In the pale morning light, the blinds in the children's room hung half an inch lower than they had the night before. Someone, Holm or someone else, had moved them again. And the worst part was, it didn't feel like a message to him. It felt like a message to someone who wasn't there. July 18th, 1984. Location, Dayton, Ohio. The humidity settled heavy over the city by late afternoon, turning the air thick enough to feel on the skin. Delaney had been parked 2 blocks from Holm's boarding house since mid-morning. Engine off, windows cracked. He'd been watching Holm through a pair of binoculars, the man sitting in a dim upstairs room with the curtains half drawn. Holm wasn't doing much. Sipping coffee, reading the paper, occasionally glancing toward the street like a man waiting for someone. It was the stillness that put Delaney on edge. Men who were harmless didn't watch like that. Shortly before 6, Holm stood, tossed the paper aside, and left. He carried nothing but a worn canvas satchel slung over one shoulder. Delaney waited until he was half a block ahead before starting the car. Holmes' route was slow, meandering, past the corner store, through an alley that smelled faintly of spoiled produce from the dumpster behind it, then across Birkwood Court. He didn't approach the McRae house directly. Instead, he cut behind the property, slipping into the narrow space between the garage and the neighbor's fence. Delaney stayed back, pretending to light a cigarette, watching as Holmes crouched low and peered into the kitchen window. Holmes didn't go in. Not this time. He stayed there perfectly still for almost 2 full minutes before backing away. Then he crossed the yard into the shadows of the hedgerow. That's when Delaney saw her. A woman stepped out from between the trees, early 40s, dark hair pulled into a loose braid. She wore a pale yellow dress and moved with the kind of ease that came from knowing you weren't supposed to be noticed. Holmes turned toward her like he'd been expecting her. They spoke in low voices, their faces partly hidden by the branches. Delaney slid lower in his seat, straining to hear. He caught fragments. Still there, and can't risk, before the woman glanced sharply toward the street. Delaney's pulse kicked. She must have seen something, maybe the glint off his side mirror, because she stepped back into the trees without another word. Holmes followed. Delaney started the car. He rolled slowly past, trying to spot them again, but the hedgerow swallowed them whole. By the time he circled the block, they were gone. When Delaney reported back that night, Mercer sat forward in his chair. "You're telling me Holmes wasn't alone?" "No," Delaney said. "And whoever she is, she knows that house too." "Describe her." Delaney did, and Mercer scribbled the details down. "You think she's the one who went in before Holmes?" "Could be," Delaney said. "Could also be she's the one telling him when to go in." Mercer tapped the end of his pen against the desk. "Find her." The next day, Delaney returned to the boarding house stakeout. Holmes didn't leave until late afternoon, and when he did, he didn't take the usual route. Instead, he boarded a bus heading toward the west side. Delaney followed in his own car, 2 vehicles behind the bus until it stopped near a block of aging brick row houses. Holmes got off, crossed the street, and went inside number 412. The place was run down, paint peeling from the shutters, weeds pushing through the cracks in the front steps. Delaney waited. 20 minutes later, the woman emerged. Same braid, different dress. She carried a paper bag tucked under her arm, scanning the street before heading east. Delaney followed her for 6 blocks, past shuttered storefronts and a boarded-up movie theater, until she reached a small diner on the corner. She went inside. Through the window, Delaney watched her sit in a booth with 2 men. One was in his 30s, wiry with a mustache. The other was older, heavy-set, and wore a dark suit despite the heat. They spoke for a long time. No one smiled. The heavy-set man slid something across the table, a small object wrapped in brown paper. The woman slipped it into her bag without opening it. Delaney couldn't shake the feeling he was looking at the real center of this thing, not Holmes. That night, Delaney and Mercer went back to number 412. They parked down the street, engine off, and waited until the lights in the front room went dark. Mercer moved first, hugging the shadow of the building. The front door had a flimsy lock that gave after 2 minutes with a thin pick. Inside, the air was stale, tinged with the faint scent of mildew and something else. Something metallic. The living room was sparsely furnished. A couch against one wall, a coffee table stacked with old newspapers. On the far wall hung a framed photograph of the McRae family. It was the same photo Mercer had seen on their missing persons file. They didn't have long. 20 minutes, maybe less. Mercer took the downstairs, Delaney the upstairs. In the kitchen, Mercer found a drawer full of unopened mail, all addressed to the McRaes, postmarked after the date they vanished. Someone had been intercepting it. Upstairs, Delaney found a sewing room. On the table were scraps of fabric, all cut into small squares, and a half-finished dress in pale yellow. When Mercer joined him, they both stared at it in silence. "Same color she was wearing," Delaney said. "Yeah." Mercer's jaw tightened. "She's keeping something of theirs. Maybe more than something." They were almost to the front door when a sound froze them in place. The creak of a step on the porch. Mercer killed the light. Both men pressed flat against the wall. The door opened. A figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the faint streetlight. It wasn't home. It wasn't the woman. It was the heavy-set man from the diner. He paused in the doorway like he could smell them there. Mercer's hand went to his holster. The man shut the door, bolted it, and walked toward the kitchen. Mercer signaled Delaney toward the back exit. They slipped out the rear, down the steps, and into the alley before the man ever knew they were there. But Mercer knew one thing now. Holm wasn't just some drifter with bad habits. He was part of a chain. And the woman in yellow? She wasn't just an accomplice. She was the link they'd have to break to get to the truth. July 21st, 1984. Location, Dayton, Ohio. The next 3 days moved like heat through asphalt. Slow, heavy, pressing down on every thought. Mercer kept his distance from Holm, knowing now that the real current was running through the woman. They didn't know her name. The boarding house ledger listed no female occupants, and Holm's own room had no trace of anyone else. But she moved through the neighborhood like a shadow with its own map. Delaney had started calling her Pale Yellow. The name stuck, partly because she wore that same color often, partly because there was something washed out about her presence, like she'd been standing in the sun too long, fading into whatever space she occupied. On Saturday afternoon, Mercer spotted her leaving number 412 again. This time she carried no bag, just a folded piece of paper in one hand. She walked briskly toward the bus stop, boarded without hesitation, and rode south. Mercer and Delaney followed in the car, letting the bus get ahead, then closing the distance when she stepped off 2 miles later. The neighborhood was quieter here. Brick homes with sagging porches, a street lamp flickering in the daylight. She stopped at the third house from the corner, knocked once, and waited. An elderly man answered. Pale Yellow handed him the paper, spoke briefly, then turned away. Mercer caught a glimpse of the paper in his hands, a photograph curled at the edges. She continued down the block to a narrow side street and ducked into a building with no sign out front. Mercer waited until she was inside, then crossed the street, pretending to study a parking meter. Through a sliver of dirty glass, he saw her seated at a table with 3 other women. It looked like a sewing circle, thread, fabric scraps, teacups, but there was a tension in the way they leaned close, speaking in low tones, passing small objects beneath the table. When Pale Yellow reached into her dress pocket, Mercer saw her hand emerge with something metallic, a key. She slid it to the woman beside her. The woman nodded once and tucked it into a cloth pouch. By the time Pale Yellow left, Mercer was already circling the block to intercept. He fell in step behind her, close enough to hear the faint swish of her skirt. Halfway down the street, she turned abruptly into an alley. Mercer followed. She was waiting for him. "You've been watching me," she said, not a question. Her voice was low, unshaken. "I've been watching a lot of people," Mercer said. She smiled faintly. "And yet you keep ending up behind me." "I'm looking for the McRaes." The smile vanished. "Then you're wasting your time." "Am I?" Mercer stepped closer. "Because I've seen you in their yard. I've seen you with Holm. I've seen you carrying their mail." Her eyes narrowed. "You think that's proof of something? I think you know what happened to them." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she turned, continuing down the alley. Mercer matched her pace. At the end of the alley, she stopped again. "You don't want the truth?" she said softly. You want a version of it you can live with. Try me. She studied him, as if weighing whether he could survive whatever she was about to say. Then she shook her head. Not here. Then where? She glanced past him toward the mouth of the alley. You'll know. And with that, she slipped into the street and was gone. Mercer didn't sleep that night. He kept replaying her words, the deliberate way she'd said, "You'll know." The next morning, he got his answer. On his doorstep lay a small envelope with no return address. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph. It showed the McRae kitchen, the table set for 4, a pot on the stove, steam frozen in the frame. And in the corner of the photo, barely visible in the shadow, was pale yellow. She was looking directly at the camera. July 23rd, 1984. Location, Dayton, Ohio. The Polaroid sat on Mercer's kitchen table all morning like an object that could burn skin if touched too long. He'd been in this game long enough to know when something was staged and when something was real. This was real. The grain, the uneven flash glare, the faint fingerprint smudge in the lower corner. None of it looked manipulated. And that steam frozen in mid-roll, as though someone had pressed the shutter at the precise moment the house had been breathing, living. That detail bit hardest. The McRae kitchen had been cold when police arrived. No pot on the stove, no food in sight, no steam, which meant the photo wasn't just a glimpse into the house before the disappearance. It was from the night. He slid the photo into an evidence sleeve, grabbed his jacket, and drove to the McRae property. The place still wore that cordoned-off quiet. Chain-link panels leaning in the weeds, windows shuttered with warped plywood. The kitchen door was padlocked. He stood there, comparing angles in his mind, tracing the photo's frame against reality. The shadow in the Polaroid corner, pale yellow, had been standing near the pantry. That corner now was empty. No pantry door, just plaster cracked open to studs. By mid-afternoon, Mercer was at the county records office, pulling the McRae property file. Blueprints, maintenance requests, insurance claims. The last permit was from 1978, a kitchen remodel. And there it was. Pantry removed, wall pushed back. Someone had undone that remodel before the night of the disappearance. He tapped the blueprint with his pen. You have any subcontractor lists from that year? The clerk frowned. Not that far back. Closest you'll get is names on the property tax receipts. The tax file listed a handful of contractors. One jumped out at Mercer. H. Gallows Construction. The name was familiar. He'd seen it in a newspaper clipping from '72 about a missing man whose house was later found gutted inside. The only thing left intact was the kitchen. Mercer called Delaney. You ever hear of Gallows Construction? A pause, then, yeah, but not the way you're thinking. They weren't just contractors. By evening, they were in Delaney's basement, the table cluttered with file boxes. Delaney slid one across. Inside were 8 case folders, each marked unsolved. He flipped one open, 1974, a family of 3 gone. Another, 1979. 2 sisters vanished after reporting strange noises in their home. The thread. In every case, Gallows Construction had been on site within 6 months before the disappearance. They'd come in for repairs, Delaney said. Then something would change in the layout. A wall shifted, a door sealed, a pantry disappeared. And the police never connected it. Some did. They just couldn't prove anything. The houses were always clean. No prints, no sign of struggle. Just wrong. Mercer studied the Polaroid again. In the far right edge, just above the steam, a sliver of the pantry's interior was visible. Shelves and something metallic glinting. He pulled a magnifier from his pocket. The object was a key. Not like a house key. Smaller, rounded, the kind used for lockers or storage units. The next day, Mercer started calling every storage facility within a 10-mile radius. He got polite refusals, clipped hang-ups, and one manager who told him flat out that without a court order, he'd get nothing. But at the 12th facility, the manager hesitated when Mercer mentioned small rounded keys. "We've got a few old lockers like that, haven't been rented in years. But if you're saying it's tied to an active investigation, I am." The lockers were in a dim side hallway, the air thick with dust. The manager pointed. "That one hasn't been opened since '83. Mercer's hand tightened around the photo in his pocket. The lock matched the one in the pantry shelf. "Who rented it?" he asked. The manager checked a clipboard. "Name on file is H. Gallows." They drilled the lock. The door creaked open to reveal a metal shelving unit stacked with boxes. Mercer pulled the top one down. Inside were photographs. Dozens of Polaroids, each showing a different kitchen, living room, or bedroom. Some were empty. Some had people in them. Families mid-dinner, children playing on rugs, a man reading the paper. In every one, the subjects were looking at the camera, as if they knew it was there. July 24th, 1984. Location: Dayton, Ohio. The smell inside the locker was the first thing Mercer noticed. Not rot, not mold, paper and dust, the stale weight of things that had been sealed away long enough to forget light. He and Delaney stood shoulder to shoulder, flipping through Polaroids under the flicker of a failing overhead bulb. The photos spanned years, maybe decades. Different houses, different families. None of them labeled, none of them staged like portraits. These were moments caught mid-motion. A woman sliding a casserole into the oven. A boy sitting cross-legged on the carpet, holding a toy truck. A teenage girl laughing with her mouth open, eyes darting toward the edge of the frame. And always, that faint, centered focus on the background rather than the people. By the third box, the pattern began to warp. Mercer pulled one out and froze. The kitchen was sleek, modern, not a trace of the '70s wood paneling or linoleum floors they'd seen so far. White tile, brushed steel appliances, recessed lighting. "This isn't from the same era," he said. Delaney leaned in. "You're telling me that's future?" Mercer nodded. "Or at least later. You see that brand of fridge? Didn't exist until this year. But the file on Gallows goes back to the '60s. They stared at the photo. 2 children were in the frame, a boy and a girl, neither older than 8. Both were barefoot, their faces half turned toward something just outside view. They found more like it. A living room with furniture Mercer had only seen in catalog previews. A kitchen island with granite, something unheard of in middle-class Dayton homes. A sliding glass door opening to a yard where the grass ended abruptly in bare dirt. "These places," Delaney said slowly, "they might not even have been built yet." The idea lodged like a splinter in Mercer's mind. Gallows wasn't just photographing families in their homes. He was documenting places, some before they were finished. Late afternoon sunlight sliced through the storage facility's high windows when Mercer found the photo that stopped him cold. The McRae family. All 4 of them. They were sitting at their kitchen table, steam rising from bowls of soup, hands resting flat against the tablecloth. The photo was dated in faded ink along the bottom. March 18th, 1983, 9:04 p.m. The official report said the McRaes were last seen March 18th, sometime after 8:30. Delaney's voice was tight. "This was taken less than an hour before they disappeared." Mercer flipped it over. Nothing on the back, except a faint grease smudge, like someone's thumbprint. "Get this to the lab," he said. They worked through the last box. One photo in particular made Mercer's pulse hitch. It was of a narrow hallway with pale yellow walls. On the left, a closed door. On the right, a mirror reflecting a man's arm. The cuff of a work shirt, a watch. Mercer recognized the watch. He'd seen it in an old missing persons flyer from '75. A man named Ronald Adkins, last seen wearing it the night his family vanished. By early evening, they had 112 photographs spread across Delaney's basement table. "We need to map them," Mercer said. "See where these houses are, or were Delaney's side. You know, some of them will be gone, torn down, rebuilt. Then we find the ones still standing." The first match was easy, a house on Lawndale Avenue. They drove there the next morning. The current owner, a middle-aged woman in a sun hat, peered at the photo in Mercer's hand. "This is my kitchen," she said slowly. "But that table isn't mine, and I don't know those people." "When was the kitchen remodeled?" She shrugged. "We moved in 1986. It was like this then." "Why?" Mercer didn't answer. His eyes were on the far wall, where a faint rectangular outline marred the paint. The same spot in the photo where a door had once been. That night, back in his apartment, Mercer pinned the photographs to his wall in clusters. McRae's at the center. Around them, other families. Further out, the modern houses. In between, he began to see a sequence. A progression of styles, layouts, and building methods. It was like Gallows had been moving forward through time, photographing each home as it changed hands, changed shape, and sometimes before it even existed. July 28th, 1984. Location, Kettering, Ohio. The address wasn't written anywhere. It came from the angle of a driveway, the curve of a cul-de-sac, and the shape of a street lamp barely visible in the corner of one of the Gallows photographs. Delaney found it first, tracing her finger along a folded street map, flipping between the photo and her notes. "This is it," she said finally. "Meadowlark Court." Mercer stared at the photograph again. The gleaming white kitchen with the granite island, the sliding door to the unfinished yard, the two barefoot children looking off frame. He'd been holding it for days, not letting it out of his sight. "Let's go." By late morning, the cul-de-sac lay under a heat haze. 7 houses, all facing inward, their driveways curling toward the street like bent fingers. Mercer parked 2 houses down from the one in the photograph. It looked exactly the same. White siding, black shutters, the same slope of roof. The yard, though, was full now. Green grass and a row of hedges where the bare dirt had been in the picture. A plastic tricycle sat on the front walk. The woman who answered the door had a baby on her hip. She was young, maybe 30, with wary eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked. Mercer held up his badge. "Detective Mercer, this is Officer Delaney. Sorry to bother you, but we're conducting follow-up on an old missing persons case. May we ask you a few questions about the history of your house?" Her grip on the baby shifted. "We bought it in '81, from the builder directly. We're the first owners." Delaney glanced at Mercer. "Ma'am, do you recognize these children?" She held up the photograph. The woman's brow furrowed. "That's this kitchen." "Yes. But I've never seen them before, and that's not our table, or our chairs." "When do you think this picture was taken?" Mercer asked. "I couldn't say. We moved in before the yard was done, so the dirt outside—" "That's right. But who took this?" Inside, the kitchen was a perfect match to the photo. Mercer's gaze swept the room, the counter, the island, the sliding door, before landing on a faint line in the paint above the baseboard near the pantry. "What's that?" "Oh, that's just where we had some water damage years ago. Plumber had to cut into the wall. Mind if we look?" She hesitated, then nodded. The cutout was small, patched over neatly. Mercer knelt, running his fingers along the seam. He took out his knife, pried at the edge. The section of drywall came loose with a brittle snap. Inside the gap, in the dust and insulation, was a square of folded paper. He eased it out. It was a Polaroid. The same children from the kitchen photo, but this time they were sitting cross-legged on the bare floor, their hands in their laps, eyes fixed on the camera. Behind them, visible through the doorway, was the shape of a man's arm, a work shirt, a watch. The same watch Mercer had seen in the old Ronald Adkins case file. They took the photo outside. Delaney's voice was tight. Ronald Adkins vanished with his wife and son in '75. That boy, she pointed at the Polaroid, isn't his son, which means Gallows, Mercer said. Delaney shook her head. Or someone who learned from him. That night, Mercer spread the photographs out again in his apartment. The kitchen, the children, the man's arm, the McRae's dining table, Ronald Adkins' watch. All of it pointed to one thing. Gallows, or whoever was behind the camera, hadn't just taken people. They'd moved them. Staged them in other houses. Houses that didn't exist yet. Near midnight, Mercer picked up the phone. He dialed a number he hadn't used in years. An old informant who'd once told him Gallows had a way of seeing houses before anyone else could. When the man answered, his voice was hoarse. "Mercer, haven't heard from you since the Hartley case. What's this about?" "I need to know how Gallows picked his houses." The line went quiet. Then, he didn't pick 'em. They were given to him. Someone with blueprints. Someone who knew exactly when they'd be built and who'd be living there. "Who?" The informant chuckled without humor. "You think I'd still be breathing if I said? You start looking in the planning office records. You'll see the same name over and over, same developer, same street layouts. Gallows was just the delivery boy." 2 days later, Mercer was in the county records office. Delaney flipped through file folders, scanning building permits. "Here," she said, sliding one over. "Meadowlark Court, same developer. Another. Lawndale Avenue, same developer. Another and another." The name was stamped in clean black ink. Palisade Homes, LLC. The company still existed, and they were building again in a brand new subdivision less than 10 miles from the McRae's old neighborhood. August 14th, 1984. Location: Brookhaven Estates construction site, Ohio. The subdivision wasn't on most maps yet. The road in was a dirt scar between cornfields, and the air hung with the smell of wet cement and diesel. Mercer drove past the half-built homes, skeletal frames with roof trusses silhouetted against the pale morning sky. Delaney sat beside him, eyes scanning the lots. "Lot 17, she said, pointing at a yellow stake by the roadside. That was the address listed on the Palisade Homes permit. The next house scheduled to get a kitchen layout identical to the McRae's. They parked at the edge of the cul-de-sac. The foundation was poured, the walls framed up to shoulder height. A portable generator sat silent in the dirt. No one was around. Mercer stepped through what would be the front door. The wooden frame creaked underfoot. He walked to where the kitchen would be, boards marking the space where the island would stand. Delaney trailed behind, her hand brushing one of the studs. "He wouldn't be here now," she murmured. "He comes after the drywall, before the owners move in." "I know," Mercer said, but his eyes kept roaming the site. In the far corner of the foundation was a rectangle of dirt, darker than the rest, the future pantry. Mercer crouched. The soil looked freshly turned, not compacted like the rest of the pad. He took out his folding spade and started to dig. The first thing he hit was wood, not a beam, a small box, maybe 2 feet long. He lifted it out and brushed away the dirt. It was a carpenter's toolbox, the kind with a sliding lid. Inside were Polaroids, dozens of them. Some were like the kitchen photos, empty rooms staged with borrowed furniture. Others were more disturbing, children sitting stiffly on bare floors, women standing with their arms crossed, eyes turned away from the camera. And in every photo, somewhere in the frame, there was an object Mercer recognized from a different house. It was like a thread running through every scene. Delaney's hand hovered over the stack. These are all in Palisade houses," Mercer nodded. "Which means Gallows didn't just have access, he had the run of them." They bagged the box and carried it back to the car. By the time they reached the county sheriff's office, the daylight had turned harsh, bleaching the streets. The photos were laid out on a long table in the evidence room, each one marked and catalogued. Detectives came and went, some shaking their heads, others swearing under their breath. A crime analyst traced the houses in the photos to a master list of Palisade builds between 1974 and 1983. Of the 62 houses, 14 had connections to unsolved missing persons cases. But there was one that stopped Mercer cold. A 1977 build on Weston Drive, the last known address of a man named Ronald Adkins. Adkins, his wife, and his son had never been reported missing officially. Neighbors said they'd moved away suddenly. The mortgage was paid off in cash before the sale. In the Palisade House file, there was a pre-construction photo of a kitchen identical to Lark Court, with Adkins' son sitting at the island, a school lunchbox open in front of him. And behind him, in the blurred reflection of the oven door, was the man they had been chasing for years, Gallows. The photo was enough for a warrant, but Gallows was already gone. The only trace was a trailer found in a rural storage lot, its interior gutted except for a single chair bolted to the floor and a Polaroid camera on the seat. The McRae case was closed, at least on paper. The official record said the family had likely been abducted in the window between Sunday evening and Monday morning. Their bodies were never found. Off the record, Mercer knew they'd been moved through at least 2 Palisade houses before disappearing for good. The houses had been the cages, the photos, the trophies. Years later, Brookhaven Estates was finished. Families moved in. Lawns grew. The street names were cheerful: Willow Run, Sunnybrook, Dogwood Lane. Mercer drove through once, in an unmarked car. The houses looked the same as any other subdivision, but he couldn't look at them without seeing the empty rooms first, before the furniture, before the laughter, before anyone called them home. Just drywall and silence. On his way out, he passed Lot 17. A minivan sat in the driveway. 2 children played in the yard, chasing each other through the sprinklers. Their mother stood at the kitchen window watching them. From the street, Mercer could see the granite island behind her. The same island, the same sliding door, the same place where a photograph had been taken years before. A photograph no one in that house would ever see.